A really good friend once told me that everything in life is a deal with the devil. The trick is to try to figure out which devil that you're dealing with. In other words, everything has a cost and a reward. Anytime you want anything in life, if it's more money, if it's more freedom, if it's more books on your bookshelves, if it's more instruments, it's going to cost you. You're going to find yourself in a Faustian bargain. And that is why the Faust Legend is so impactful to all of us throughout all of history. The Faust Legend is simple. It's so simple that most of us are pretty familiar with it. It starts off with Dr. Faustus, a man of absolute genius, a man of science, a man who has spent his entire life exploring and researching and intellectually diving into every aspect known to man. He was an alchemist, he was a medicine man, he was a philosopher. But in the end, all this information and all this knowledge left him feeling vacant and empty. And like we see in the Christian Bible in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's overwhelmed with sadness. He's become so knowledgeable, so intelligent, so elevated to the state of genius that life has become a burden to him. He ate of the little book and it became bitter. He became sickened at his stomach. He was nauseated by life. And so he became overwhelmed with melancholy, became overwhelmed with depression. And inevitably, he started to question suicide. Now then, at Dr. Faustus's darkest moment, at his absolute rock bottom, all of a sudden, weird events start occurring in his life. He sees a strange dog. There's a plague that's sweeping the community that he's living in. And then all of a sudden, things get really bizarre. He tries to manifest the spirit of nature, the goddess of nature, the god of nature. And nature rejects him. Nature comes to him and says, "You're nothing to me. Who are you? You're a nobody. You're insignificant." And this deepens Faustus's existential crisis. This really puts a finalized touch to the painting of despair that Faustus is feeling. And it negates his whole optimism that he's trying to cling to. Its final attempt at finding meaning to life is shredded right before his eyes. But nevertheless, something else takes place. All of a sudden, this bizarre little dog that's been following him around with this ominous character turns into none other than Mephistopheles, a demon of Satan. Some interpret it as Satan himself, but nonetheless it is a demonic, devilish character in the Germanic mythos. And he comes to Faust, and he presents himself to Faust, and he makes the ultimate devil's bargain. And then the rest of the story we all pretty well know. It's a pretty well-known story. Faust and Mephistopheles go on these grandiose adventures, and he sees all these luxuries. He's re-granted his youth, but his youth gets him into trouble. He finds love, but love gets him into trouble. He's fulfilling all of his whims and his desires, but all of his whims and desires turn out to be destructive. And that is the devil's contract. That is the Faustian bargain. And that is an archetypal phenomenon. It is something that we all experience in some way, shape, or form, which is why the Faust legend has prevailed so long and is so impactful even to this day. In fact, in our modern world, I find it even more impactful than any time in history, because today we are presented again and again and again and again with ultimate Faustian bargains. The legend of Faust is really prehistoric. It seems to represent elemental forces, archetypal phenomenon within the human existence. We find them in fairy tales. We find Faustian bargains in early pagan stories. But the real legend of Dr. Faust, the legend that we know with Mephistopheles, with Dr. Faust, with what we see presented in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, is really rooted in an actual phenomenon and an actual occurrence with a real person, Johann Faustus. He was a contemporary of Martin Luther. Martin Luther, of course, being the one who translated the Bible, the Christian Bible, into German for the first time. And this Faustus was an alchemist, and this alchemical philosophy and science that he was practicing, we oftentimes in the modern world look back on it and scoff at it. We say these guys were lunatics, they were crazed, they were stupid, they were delusional. But as Dr. Carl Gustav Jung has showed us again and again and throughout all of his writings, is that this was a proto-science. So with a proto-science, there's obviously a lot of failures, there's obviously a lot of shortcomings, but nonetheless it was in a pioneering field. It was taking new steps, it was taking new leaps and bounds. So with this, yes, there's failures that come, but that does not devalue the genius of these early alchemists. This does not in any way negate their intellectual capacities. And as Dr. Jung has showed again and again, there was deep philosophical elements to alchemy. But not only deep philosophical elements, but they seem to have a very innate and symbolic understanding of psychology. And Dr. Carl Jung implemented the alchemical philosophies and principles in creating his own therapeutic psychology, or therapeutic psychoanalysis, in other words. So alchemy was not ignorance, it was genius, but it was early stage genius. It wasn't genius that we think of in the modern world, albeit it was still very fascinating, but it was very looked down upon by the Christian world and by the church. It was very much looked at as a form of heresy and a form of anti-establishment. So all alchemists were denounced. So it had to be spoken of symbolically. It had to be practiced in an underworld, secretive atmosphere. With this, alchemy became highly mystified, and we look at it in today's term with high degree of esoteric and occult-like themes. We look at it through the lens of the uncanny and the occult and the supernatural, but that's not what it was in its original form. Instead, what alchemy was certainly a science. It was a philosophy, and it was an attempt, like religions, like mythologies, like philosophy, psychology, neurology. It's all an attempt to understand the elemental forces of our world and of our existence. So alchemy was precious to the practitioners, yet absolutely horrifying to an outsider looking in. So Johann Faustus, being an alchemist and an open alchemist, of course took on a diabolical and sinister, ominous, and evil-like presence. He became an ideal character or symbol for everything that was anti-Christian, everything that was evil. Yet Faustus made a living off his alchemical practices. We would tend to think of him as a snake oil salesman today. He would travel from community to community, town to town, and he would perform these magic feats through his alchemical practices. And he would sell tinctures, and he would sell oils, he would sell all these potions and so forth, which would cure this, which could provide this. And when his failures would mount up in a particular community, he would move on. We tend to think of him only in context of his failures, but we fail to realize ourselves, again committing a failure, that he was successful in some endeavors, or else he would have been ran out of town immediately. And that he had to have had something to pitch, had something to sell, or else he would have been a nobody. And this is where his reputation really comes into context, because he developed a reputation that to gain these secrets, to gain this hidden information, and to gain these alchemical talents, he was believed to have sold his soul to Satan or Lucifer. And so with this reputation, which would follow him everywhere he went, that really is the fundamental element where all of history, where all the fairy tales and all the old pagan lores become modernized in the context that we know it. Johann Faustus all of a sudden became the symbol for the man who sold his soul to the devil. And that, of course, created the Faustus Legend. And that is where everything begins. That is where all of the Mephistophelian devil contract Faustian bargain really finds its origins. And each time we see Faustus mentioned in real life by his contemporaries, it was in this context. It was denouncing him. It was belittling him. It was using him as an example of evil incarnate, of allowing our desires to triumph our greater logic. And as a blasphemous person put into human flesh. Martin Luther, for instance, mentions Johann Faustus as a real person twice, both times denouncing him in this cliche light and in this formation, so to speak. But overall, the real life Faustus is extremely mysterious to us. We have no idea anything about the man himself. We only know the stigmas associated with him, the ideas that were pinned to him. But it was said that he died in an alchemical explosion. This, of course, became mythologized to where he was killed by a legion of demons. His limbs twisted, his neck snapped, his face turned backwards, petrified with fear. And that is exactly where we see the legend really starting to flourish and really becoming fascinating to people. But immediately after the death of the real person, an explosion indeed did take place. And that is where the Faustian story infiltrated history and reshaped the overall psychology of the human species. Eventually, Dr. Faustus's reputation grew to the point of fascination where books were being written about him, pamphlets and essays out the wazoo. Eventually, roughly 40 years after his death in 1587, a first publication of Faust appears in a small chapbook called the Historia von Dr. Johann Faustin. And immediately after this, it created a whirlwind of other books that were written. And eventually in 1592, an English translation was made and found its way into the hands of none other than Christopher Marlowe. Then in 1604, Christopher Marlowe published The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. And this is what really solidified the entirety of the Faustian legend and would go on to later inspire Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's version of Faust, which is the one that we all know by heart and which altered literary evolution forever and really put the devil motif into perspective in the human psyche. Now, it is interesting to note that Christopher Marlowe himself was a type of Faustian figure, a tragic genius of sorts, and he was known as the rebel of the Elizabethan literature. He was noted for pushing boundaries and using controversial themes and figures. He challenged the religious status quo and explored new forms of literature. He refused to stick with the normal and the traditional, and he was always putting into question social norms and laws of the day. He was very deep and introspective, he was extremely philosophical, and he was a non-stop contrarian. Also, like the original real-life Faust, Marlowe's early life was completely shrouded in mystery. But what we do know is that he lived a very layered and complex life. For instance, we do know that he was an agent of the crown, a sort of early day type spy, and he was among the first to make an actual living based on writing. In other words, he was one of the first professional writers. He moved to London and found that the audience wanted violence and sensationalism, and he provided just that, making a flourishing career and name and reputation for himself. Yet it is interesting to note that most people know Marlowe today. However, his life was cut short. He only finished 4 plays in his lifetime, but they proved to be absolutely influential and pivotal, having influence on Shakespeare and very specifically Shakespeare's Macbeth. But everybody knows Shakespeare. So very few people understand that it was Marlowe who inspired and shaped and set the path for Shakespeare. Yet Shakespeare's most famous play was Macbeth, and that was directly influenced by Marlowe's version of Faustus. Now then, imagine this. It's the Elizabethan era, and a new play has just opened up in a theater, and it's creating a sensation. Other authors are writing about it. Other playwrights are either completely for it or completely against it, but nonetheless, it's stirring up great controversy. And outside the theater, which is a new theater in the Elizabethan era, Christians are gathering in protest. And inside, you go in, and there you find the play unfolding of Christopher Marlowe's Faustian bargain. The devil appears. There's all sorts of alchemical symbols and occult symbols incorporated into the play. And then rumors start to circulate that the devil himself actually showed up to see how he was portrayed in Marlowe's play. Would this not be fascinating? Would this not be one of the most groundbreaking and pivotal aspects of the entire Elizabethan era? It would have taken the world by storm, and that is exactly what it did. But then, keeping in theme with the Faustian aspect, Christopher Marlowe died young. He died at the age of 29. And the circumstances around his death were rather mysterious. He died in a brothel, supposedly in a fight that was related to a tab. But a lot of people speculate that there was some supernatural forces associated with his death. This, of course, is a far reach, and I don't believe this at all. But there is some conspiracy associated with his death, which I find highly plausible. And it seems, since he was an agent of the crown, that there was a political motivation behind his death, and that perhaps, just maybe, his death was actually not just a random murder, but an assassination. Yet, Marlowe's version of Faust continued to be acted out all over Europe, even after his death, and it continued to be altered, and other playwrights were making their own versions of it. And then it was put into print, and this was spread out all over Europe, and this really helped to popularize the idea of the Devil's Contract and Marlowe's version of Faust. And with this, it completely altered human history. Now the Devil's Contract, the Devil's Bargain, was injected into the atmosphere of the human existence.